Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. We're thrilled to have such a great audience for today's conversation. My name is Kathy Jacobs, and I'm the director of the Center for Climate Adaptation, Science and Solutions here within the Institute of the Environment and also associated with the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. One of the reasons that we host these events is to build community and to engage the community in topics related to adaptation and all kinds of natural resources policy. And so we're very happy to see today that in the room we have a lot of members of the community as well as faculty, staff, and students. The person who is here today to talk to us is actually sort of a hero in our time. And I'm sure all of you have seen some press related to Joel's recent activities that obviously took an awful lot of personal, has taken a big personal toll for him to sort of stand up to the current administration and point out what's actually going on. When I was in DC myself, our paths crossed a number of times. He was essentially the lead climate science advisor to the Secretary of the Interior, but also represented the Department of the Interior at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, where I worked and ran the National Climate Assessment. And we have had many occasions then and since to have conversations. Joel is fundamentally a scientist. He spent more than a decade doing field biology before he got sucked into the science policy world. He works on connecting science and policy in the same way that many of us here today do, and many of the rest of us wish we were. He also has a background working with foundations and funding work related to connecting science and policy in the Pacific Northwest. And he's here today to essentially tell you his story about what's going on in Washington. He will take questions afterwards, and we are incredibly grateful to you for being here today. Thank you so much, Joel.
Thanks very much. Is this mic working? Okay, great. Thanks very much, Kathy. Thanks. It's wonderful to be here at University of Arizona. I want to thank the Center for Climate Adaptation, Science and Solutions and Kathy Jacobs, with whom it was a pleasure to work when she was out in DC. It's great to be in Tucson too. It couldn't be more different from my native Maine, but the natural surroundings here really pull on me. And I was going to say something about how great the weather is, but last week I was giving a talk at Harvard University in Massachusetts, and it was 10 degrees warmer than this right now. So there's nothing going on there though, right? I mean, nothing strange. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk a bit about climate risk and the impacts on communities in the Arctic. And then I'm going to describe my experience as a whistleblower to give you a sense of what we'll need to overcome to start solving those issues. And then I'm going to summarize a few areas of inquiry that I think will be helpful in trying to overcome those things. I'm going to start with an unusual slide to begin with when you're talking about the Arctic in Arizona. But I mentioned I'm a native Mainer. Are there any Mainers in exile here? Any? Yeah, Kathy spends a lot of time. Okay, good. So you may be familiar with the Maine state motto, which is Dirigo, which means I lead. And it's referring to Polaris, the North Star, which is there at the top of the emblem, a symbol of guidance and direction. And for the Norse, they called it the lodestar. Medieval mariners called it Stella Maris. They called it Polaris. That Arab mariners called it Al Judai, and even Shakespeare in Julius Caesar described the North Star. He called it the one in all doth hold his place. So I hate to use puns, but Polaris has this stellar reputation for reliability. It's so reliable, it's so well placed in the heavens that we use it in metaphor all the time, as in science is the North Star of public policy. And of course, in DC right now, that's taking a hiatus, but that is something that we think about. We all have our North Stars. For scientists, it might be truth. For other people, it's honesty or service or love. And for the African slaves escaping from the American South, the North Star meant freedom, right? And so for the Inuit cultures of the North in the Arctic, it also is as a symbol of the wisdom and the leadership of the elders. It holds great importance. We are, however, I probably should pivot quickly before this is the North Star in the Nunavut flag in Eastern Canada. It's called Nuksuituk, and it is that symbol for wisdom and leadership there. But since we're going to be talking about the U.S., I had to look really hard to find a flag that might also contain the North Star. But of course, thankfully, the state of Alaska has obliged. So what you're looking at there is pretty much the only constant in the Arctic right now, the North Star. You could say the Aurora Borealis, but the point is this symbol of wisdom and leadership and guidance and direction hangs up there, while the absence of those values has led to this situation in the Arctic where everything else is transforming before our eyes. It was avoidable, and it's creating innumerable difficulties for those who both live in and depend upon the Arctic. And, you know, I think probably most of the people in this room are familiar with what's happening in the Arctic, right? That it's warming faster than twice as fast as the rest of the planet, that the sea ice extent is setting record lows every year, and that these temperature anomalies are happening so often now that I'm not sure we can even call them anomalies anymore. I don't know what the limitation is on that. This was January 2016, when we really thought this was an anomaly. This was stunning to see that kind of heat in the Arctic. And I remember thinking, holy cow, you know, I hope this doesn't happen again. Well, it's become a regular occurrence. And right now, of course, you've probably been reading some of the reports about this year's anomaly. It's very striking. And the northernmost observing station, which is closest to the North Pole, is at the north end of Greenland. And they've just recorded temperatures in the 40s in February at the North Pole, right? That's appalling. There's open water north of Greenland right now. For that matter, last week, you could have sailed, some of the meteorologists and climate scientists in Alaska reported out that you could have sailed through the Bering Strait into the Chukchi Sea in the Arctic last week, which is appalling. Normally, the sea ice extent is well into the Bering Sea by this time of year. So this is an exceptional year. But we may find that it's not exceptional going into the future. Now, for certain commercial interests, of course, this presents opportunities. But for those who live up there, it's just creating, and for the Alaska Native villages in particular, it's creating an existential threat. So each village up there, I'm going to talk a lot about the Alaska Native villages as a way of describing what's happening and what the risks of climate change mean on the ground. But you can think about lots of other places, including the desert Southwest, as I'm doing this. Each village in the Arctic is unique. They have unique cultures and traditions, often a distinct dialect, and a unique relationship to the surrounding ecosystems and climate and solitude and time that makes them distinctly unique, and even in those ways. So it's not an overstatement to say that each one of these villages punches way above its weight in terms of its contribution to global cultural diversity, right? So these communities are remarkable. They persisted through millennia in incredibly forbidding conditions in the Arctic, amazing resilience. Their culture is so tightly interwoven with the surrounding ecosystems and climate that I don't think it's a stretch to say that they are the planet's foremost Arctic experts up there. But even they have never seen a rate of change like what we're seeing now. No humans have seen this rate of change in the Arctic. And this remarkable resilience has been so constrained by non-Indigenous actors in the Arctic that many of them are right now at risk of being wiped right off the map up there in the region, in the Arctic region, in some places. And you may have seen this picture 100 times. This is in the village of Shishmaref, Alaska. But in particular, some of these villages, by no fault of their own, are located in some of the most vulnerable places on Earth right now. Right? I mean, they were initially set upon. There are these islands and spits of land, right? I mean, I wish we could pull up. And I wish I had a slide of the whole island. But you can see that they're sitting there facing the brunt of storms coming off the Bering and Chukchi Seas. Many of these villages are on rivers that are quickly eroding out from under them. Now, historically, they were locked in place with permafrost, and they were protected. Before the storms came in the fall, the sea ice would set up, so there'd be no wave action and no erosion. And of course, that's no longer the case in most of these places. The permafrost is degrading beneath their feet, and the sea ice isn't setting up. I don't think Barrow saw sea ice until well into November. So the storms have already come and gone in some cases and chewed away more meters of land. And they don't have a lot of meters of land to give, as you can see in this picture. So even for over 10 years now, even the federal government in the US has acknowledged that these are dangerous locations, not safe for habitation. But unfortunately, the federal government is not there to help right now. They have completely turned their backs on these folks. And I'm going to give you a taste of that by explaining how I became a whistleblower. And got to put up your generic whistleblower slide while I do this. For nearly, as Kathy mentioned, for nearly 7 years, I was in the federal government. I was running the policy office at Interior. I was also the lead climate policy advisor. Now, there's not one aspect of the mission at Interior that isn't affected by climate change. Anything from managing those legendary national parks to protecting our country's biodiversity, providing world-class scientific knowledge through USGS, managing 20% of the US surface area. DOI has a very diverse set of responsibilities and missions, and not one of them can you succeed at without considering climate change. So I was very vocal about this, and I spoke frequently in public about the need to address these resilience and adaptation needs, particularly as they relate to the Alaska Native villages, because that's a place where health and safety are at issue. Now, even after the, oh, and I should mention, a lot of you already know this, but DOI is the federal trustee for American Indians and Alaska Natives. So their well-being should be core to the mission at DOI. And when we had that presidential election in 2016 that some of you may remember, I was kind of like, I was reassuring people that we're going to still be working on adaptation and resilience. That's not going to be in the crosshairs. EPA is screwed. They work on greenhouse gases. There's going to be a lot of trouble there, but we're always going to be working on adaptation because we can see the impacts before our eyes. They're happening now, and it's a threat and a risk for Americans. So obviously, I feel like a fool now because I had vastly overestimated the integrity and the maturity of the incoming politicals of the Trump administration. What followed was an all-out assault on anything that had a whiff of climate change to it, or for that matter, anything the previous administration had touched. It was like being led by this gang of vindictive fifth graders. And when I talk about this, when I first started talking about this, I was saying seventh graders. And I've just noticed that not even consciously, I keep reducing the number. And just last week, I think we heard that President Trump speaks at a fourth grade level. So I think it's actually time to take it down another notch. So I may have to revise again pretty soon. But at any rate, their goal was to eliminate all Obama era programs, good or bad, to marginalize scientists and experts so they couldn't be bothered with that pesky science. And the third thing was to shrink and hobble the federal government to give industry more full access to public resources. And we've seen this over and over. It's a series of punches, and they're kind of ham-fisted about it, but they're going after the laws and the rules and the regulations and the policies that protect American resources and protect American health and safety, right? And they're going directly for this stuff. And the only saving grace is that they're not very good at it, right? They're winding up in court a lot, and that's going to continue to happen. And that is, in many ways, going to protect a lot of us from some serious threats. But one of those punches was aimed at the Senior Executive Service, or SES, at Interior. And now that's the executive core of career professionals there at the agency, meant to be deployed whenever you need high-level but non-political expertise, right? It's still part of the civil service, non-political appointees. There are about 225 SESers at DOI. I was one of those out of about 70,000 employees. So, and every administration, when they come in, they move a few of these folks around for various different reasons. But no agency in any administration has ever come in I moved dozens of SESers in one night with the obvious intent, I believe, to dislodge us from the civil service entirely. Now, to do this, they moved people into jobs that were completely unrelated to their experience or backgrounds. They moved people across the country. They moved people without any prior consultation. A lot of these people had, most of these people, I would say, had families. Many were retirement age. And when they finally released the list of reassignments, which took months after we had FOIA'd this, and then I sued the agency a few months later to get this information, we finally got the list. And it is clear from that list that there was a disproportionate number of American Indians who were reassigned that night. So, for starters, this is just horrible workplace management, right? They checked all the boxes of things you don't do. Everything from discrimination to workplace abuses. So that's just the beginning, right? The next week, Secretary Ryan Zinke, who was the only Senate-confirmed employee at DOI at the time, went up to the Hill to testify to Congress. And one of the things he said was that, yes, indeed, he intended to use reassignments, among other measures, to trim the DOI workforce by about 4,000 people. Now, it doesn't take a lot of thinking to realize that reassigning people doesn't trim the workforce, right? Unless you get them to quit. And while you can absolutely move SCSers around, even involuntarily, it's actually allowed, you can't do so with the intent to get them to quit. So there was Secretary Zinke testifying to Congress and admitting his unlawful strategy. So, and it was clear to me what they wanted me to do, right, when they reassigned me. I don't think Kathy mentioned this, but they really wanted me to quit. And I believe because of my work on behalf of the Alaska Natives and climate work that I've been doing, they reassigned me to the office that collects and disperses royalty income from the oil, gas, and mining industries. So that's what they decided to do with the climate change guy, right? Not subtle. Right. And I actually really liked the people in the accounting office where I was moved. They bent over backwards to try and retrain me and get me into this accounting and auditing world. And they were just super, but it's such a waste of my background and experience, my salary. It's just bad governance all around. So the mistakes continued. More importantly, and most importantly, it ended my work on behalf of the Alaska Native communities. There was no longer anyone in DC coordinating the federal response to this slow-moving disaster up there. And for those folks, climate change is not a policy debate, right? I mean, this is day-to-day health and safety stuff. They needed a concerted effort from the federal government to lead this response, and what they got was the opposite. Everything stopped. So I found a great employment attorney named Katie Atkinson, actually from this area, I think, Wilkenfeld Law, and I filed a whistleblower complaint officially with the Office of Special Counsel in Washington. And I took the unusual step of going public and publishing an op-ed in the Washington Post. And that's where I kind of announced why I was doing this and what the abuses were that led me to this step. Now, this made me the first public whistleblower in the Trump administration. And the response was fascinating to me, and I totally didn't expect any of it. Certainly there was a media response, but even the Senate responded. The 8 senators wrote a letter to the department right away saying the Inspector General needed to take a look at this. And that's an investigation that's still ongoing. They're taking a very close look at this, what I call the Thursday Night Massacre. And, we'll see what they come up with. A group of legal scholars, they were America's top legal scholars. I didn't know that at the time. Sent a letter on my behalf to the Office of Special Counsel saying, this is dangerously close to politicizing the civil service. And this is why we have a civil service, is to avoid this kind of thing. So a lot of great support. And from my federal colleagues, it was wonderful. And of course, a lot of letters and emails and just strangers reaching out saying, thank you. What a brave thing you did. And I don't agree about that. I always quote Walt Disney's underappreciated brother, Roy, who said that when values are clear, decision-making is easy. This was a no-brainer for me to do this. They'd already taken my job. All I had left was my voice, and I wanted to use it in order to show people what was happening. These abuses needed to be publicized. They would have gotten away with it. So I reiterated these concerns once again with my resignation letter. A few months later, I gave it a shot in the auditing office. But a few months later in October, I submitted that resignation letter and reiterated some of these concerns and amplified them and called for Zinke's resignation. So the Twitter sphere kind of blew up with that one. They really liked that. It's just appalling to me that these political leaders of these agencies that they were put in charge of managing are actively trying to tear them down, right? I mean, it's harmful for American health and safety. It's putting people at risk. It's putting the American economy at risk, and it's putting our natural resources at risk. So, while this is appalling across the board, what this means for Alaska Native villages, for example, is just a vivid example of what they're up to. That's why I talk about it in this context. Since my reassignment, there have been no moves to replace me or to address the slow-moving disaster. In fact, Secretary Zinke put a hold on the Tribal Resilience Grant Program, which was a small grant program at the Bureau of Indian Affairs to do exactly this, to address the resilience needs of American Indians and Alaska Natives. They just put that on hold and never announced the program again. I've heard since that they just think they need to rename it because it sounds like an Obama thing, right? I mean, that's how childish it's gotten in there. And I acknowledge that in the Obama administration, folks had a long way to go. This is a village relocation, getting people out of harm's way. It's a very long, multi-year, expensive process. But there was momentum, and there was an effort, and there was coordination, and none of that is happening now. Right? They're totally being left to their own devices. The state of Alaska is trying to step into the breach and provide a little leadership. The governor's office has been fantastic. They've developed a climate action plan where they talk about mitigation, adaptation, and response and research. So they're really on the ball, except Alaska's broke. And the Alaskan budget took a pretty serious hit when the oil prices went down, and they now are on life support financially. So they've got great leadership, but no resources. And of course the federal government is sitting this one out. So what do we do, right? We can't just shrug and just let this happen, right? We need civil society to engage. And that's the hard part. And, unless you think that this, you don't care about anything that happens north of Flagstaff, these climate impacts, sea level rise and so on, are going to affect every part of the country one way or another, particularly in coastal areas. This is a rendering of Miami in 2100 that Climate Central put together. I mean, just consider the economic consequences of that city taking a hit like that. I know that in Tucson also you're tracking water issues and temperature, other things that will dramatically affect the livability here in Tucson. So this is why I talk about these Alaska Native villages. I think we should all be watching very closely how we handle things like assisted migration or relocation, or if all else fails, dislocation, which means scatter, get out of there and go wherever, right? And that's the end of a culture. So that's why I focus on these things. What are the most important issues to consider for vulnerable or at-risk communities in the Arctic, getting people out of harm's way and so on? How do we calculate and minimize risk? There's so much to talk about here, and I tend to try and for a talk like this, I try to reduce it to the 3 R's, which are risk, resilience, and reinforcements. And I'll get into what I mean by that. But first, you need to know the level of risk. There's an entire field, thankfully, focused on risk. There's even a UN agreement called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is focused on this. That was signed by the UN in 2015, which incidentally was a super year for climate-related agreements at the UN. The Sustainable Development Goals were also signed into effect that year, and of course, the Paris Agreement in December was signed. So we have this framework in place, so we're not shooting blind. Risk is sometimes defined as hazard times exposure times vulnerability, right? And now, the hazard being the storm or sea level rise or a flood, right? Exposure is, are you in the path of that thing? And vulnerability is how susceptible are you to the impacts of that thing? Now, this talk is not about hazard. The hazard essentially is climate change. That's how we're talking about it now, right? I mean, some of these storms that are spun up and amplified by climate change. This talk is about exposure and vulnerability. And I've found the most useful concept for talking about those things is resilience. And I know some people find resilience to be a little wonky, a little much, but there is a whole field of research and practice there too. So we're not shooting blind there. Resilience being the capacity for a social ecological system to recover from a serious disruption or shock. Now that's the simplified version. Resilience scientists can go a lot further down a rabbit hole there. And they often do. And by the way, when I say social ecological system, it's with a lot of intention, because the idea is that we need to stop thinking of ecosystems and human systems independently, because they are just so interdependent that we need to think of them as interdependent systems, particularly in the Arctic, where those cultures are, the subsistence way of life inherently is just incredibly dependent upon the ecosystem. So resilience in the Arctic depends on an awful lot of things. In 2016 and 2017, the US chaired the Arctic Council. That's the 8 Arctic countries plus some indigenous representatives and observers. And we took the opportunity to write a couple of documents about resilience and try and set up a process for understanding Arctic resilience better. The first one was called the Arctic Resilience Report. And I co-chaired this on behalf of the US, and a scholar in Sweden named Johan Rockström co-chaired it on the part of Sweden. And it was the first assessment of Arctic resilience. World-class, the authors were remarkable. It's a real world-class document. And what we did then was to work with an international team of experts to develop the Arctic Resilience Action Framework. And I know we're getting into international agreements, and I don't want to spend a lot of time there, except to say that this provided a set of guiding principles and some priorities for action for the Arctic Council, and a platform for engagement and for evaluation. And remarkably, it was signed by all the Arctic foreign ministers last May, and that includes Rex Tillerson from the US. So for just a moment, the federal government did not get in the way. I wouldn't say they endorsed, but they didn't get in the way of an important resilience agreement. So there is hope there. This framework established, it was an important aspect of it, it established a platform for moving forward. And the goal for the framework was to increase measurably the ability of these communities and these systems to respond to disasters, and not just for their own social and economic development, but for the improvement or the sustainability of ecosystems. So it's important, again, to talk about both the ecosystems and the social systems. And I'm gonna put the 4 priorities for action up. I'm gonna talk about all 4 of them, but it's the last one I really wanna spend the most time talking about, because I think there's a lot of promise there. Now, the first one is about building out the science in the region. What do we know about the tipping points there? What are those thresholds we really don't want to cross? What are some of the most important feedbacks between ecosystems and social systems as they transform? What are those reciprocal feedbacks? What is the role of conservation? How do we support indigenous knowledge providers and make sure that indigenous knowledge is part of decision making? Even some of the baseline observing data we don't have in the Arctic. So there's an awful lot that needs to happen on the science front. So you really can't write a framework without having a pretty serious piece on science in there. The second one is increasing the adaptive capacity of communities. And this starts with providing some of the basic infrastructure that a lot of these communities have been doing without for forever, right? I mean, many of them haven't had this since they've been located in places where they aren't able to move around, where there is infrastructure. It's been inadequate, right? And this includes housing, sewer and water, renewable energy, broadband, waste management infrastructure. Education is another extremely important resilience issue, because it keeps youth in the community, and that's a strong indicator of resilience in local communities. Is, are the youth staying there, or are they leaving? Safety is another element of resilience. We need to build out the search and rescue capacity up there. And in some cases, and especially in the Arctic, we need to reduce exposure. We need to do that by relocating communities. And as I mentioned earlier, several of them need that now. They need it yesterday, right? Now, the third priority is about governance, and we're working with the Russian Federation, so you can't use the word governance because it means something else there, and they get kind of spun up about that. So you got to find ways to describe governance without using the word. So that's what's going on there. But this starts with empowering local communities so that they have a seat at the table and a voice in decision-making. And of course, we have a long history of top-down decision-making, right? In particular in rural communities or in tribal communities. And that ends up ignoring so much of the reality on the ground that they wind up being counterproductive. We need to trust those Arctic experts that have been there for millennia, right? So the fourth priority is steering investments, large and small, to all of the above, all of those things I just described, right? And that starts also with looking toward the local communities. There are a lot of different ways to handle this. This is the third R, by the way, reinforcements, I call it. And by reinforcements, I don't mean seawalls. I mean bringing in resources from outside a community, because a disaster is defined as a serious disruption that exceeds the ability of a community, of the affected community, to cope, right? And we, by the way, have been seeing a lot of these lately, especially in this last year, everything from Houston to Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Florida, California with the wildfires, right? Can you imagine if those places were left to their own devices without reinforcements? And I think we've seen a little bit of that with Puerto Rico. And it's horrifying, right? If we're going to leave communities to fend for themselves in the face of these kinds of things, I believe that we as a society have failed, and Puerto Rico was a scary reminder of that. Right now, we're one storm or flood away from failure in several places in the Arctic right now. They need reinforcements up there now. They need them before the disaster. There's no help on the way up there, by the way. The nearest Coast Guard station is down in Kodiak, which is a really, really long way away. And outside of the summer months, disaster response could be days. So there really is no disaster response. You can't assume anything. You have to get yourselves to safety, right? That's why relocation is so essential, in my view. Now, the state of Alaska, as I mentioned, they've got leadership, but no resources. The federal government has neither the intention to demonstrate leadership nor resources, right? So we're in this, what I consider, regrettable situation where civil society is going to need to step up and do government's job, and essentially get people out of harm's way. And this may be the way of the future. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in Miami when things start to go south there, but I have to think that civil society is going to have to play a major role there too. So where are these reinforcements going to come from? And this is where I've been spending a lot of time thinking lately. And I see three general options for finding the resources and the funding to move a village for now. The first one that everyone always brings up is philanthropy. Before this government job, I was at a foundation for 8 years, and I can say unequivocally that funders are not looking to make big capital investments. They just don't operate that way. They like to create the conditions for change and plant the seeds. They'll be great partners, but they're not going to be in the driver's seat. So I think that's a pretty tough sell. The second one is impact investing, and I'm afraid it's being used frequently as a cure-all for everything. But there is a lot of interest in investing for social impact and for social good, and a lot of really innovative financial tools out there that are being tested in various different ways. But there's also a lot of controversy about whether social impact and return on investment are compatible. So there's still a lot to be worked out there. But if someone can work it out, there are billions of dollars of resources out there just waiting to be invested that could flow toward Arctic infrastructure. But someone has to figure it out, right? I've heard, for example, that investing in debt doesn't require a whole lot of return on investment. There may be some things that can be done there. I don't know. This is not my area of expertise, but I do think that from what it sounds like to me, this is how you might improve infrastructure in a village or renewable energy installations in a village. I'm not sure it's the kind of thing that would build a new village. So that's another question that remains. And so the third area that I think about, and this is sort of a provocation because I don't know if it's insane or not, but is corporate largesse, or that kind of angel investor, kind of Jeff Bezos, or have Tesla, take it on, right? It could Bezos or Amazon or Google or Apple just move a village, right? Of course they could, right? But would they? I don't know. It depends on whether there's some form of, they get something out of it, obviously some sort of technological advantage or some sort of PR that they would value. Maybe they could, maybe they would. The question of should they is something else entirely. And that's what I worry about more, because remember that each one of these communities is a unique cultural entity, and these are people with a very close relationship with place. So to have corporations taking this on, even with close consultation, is a form of experimentation that it makes you a little bit uncomfortable given history. So I would say that if there's extensive co-equal consultation with the community, and that decision making is primarily coming from those voices in the community, those being relocated would need to say, yes, we want this, we want it done like this. If sustaining funds are available for many years into the future, and the necessary engagement with all the state and federal agencies is thought through completely well in advance, then maybe it really would be a good idea to take whoever out there has the resources to move a village if these criteria are met, right? That kind of decision should never be left to some white guy on the East Coast. But if it came down to that, or dislocation or loss of life, these are hard questions. And I think we need to unpack them, not just because of Alaska Native villages, but because of places like Tucson and Miami, right? So before I wrap up, because I want to get to some questions, but I want to get back to the meaning of the North Star, because to me, it does kind of come around to this, because it's always so striking to me in this distinctly kind of northern poetic way that this unchanging beacon is hanging up over the Arctic, this thing that has represented for millennia those very qualities that are so scarce in the public domain right now. It's up there, and those are the key. Those, wisdom, leadership, guidance, these are the key to solving these problems. And here's the symbol of all those things up there. I don't know, it always strikes me. And I hope that this kind of horrible, during this social churning that's happening right now, particularly in the lower 48, some form of civic responsibility will emerge that will produce those values, wisdom, leadership, guidance, in the quantity necessary to save lives and to save cultures. If so, I hope you all have an opportunity to be involved in that. I look forward to working with you if so. So thank you very much. I appreciate you listening to what I have to say. I'm looking forward to questions.
Thanks, Joel. So I'm sure you have provoked somebody to say something. Anybody want to ask a question? Yep. Please identify yourself.
I'm Paul Gordon from the College of Medicine. So actually more related to the story you told us about your time in the government, what really strikes me about that, and certainly it comes from a lack of knowledge, maybe a naivete, this sounded like a pretty complicated, complex plan to undo everything Obama. And it would seem to me that the people in charge aren't that smart. So whose plan is this, and who is the one that's orchestrating this, what I see to be pretty complicated?
Well, you very effectively described the secretary. I think his arrogance is his dominant quality, but There are a few individuals that have come back from the Bush administration who have a sense of how the organization works. Although I wouldn't say it's a particularly clever strategy in many cases. It is very erratic, very ham-fisted. If you want to make lasting change, they're making a lot of mistakes. Now, this incident with the senior executives is a good example of that, right? I mean, they could have, over a period of months, moved these people around and accomplished their goal without the visibility and the profile. That it's not just my story that caused this, right? This got out. It was clearly an abuse, right? So they're doing things with such hubris and aggression that it's creating stories and leading to them having to reverse their actions. Now, like I said, though, a lot of these punches are landing. But I wouldn't say it's a particularly well thought out process. Now, their goals, they are very confident. They're very certain about their goals, what they want to get to, those three things, right? Clean out what happened in the last administration, get science out of the way, and shrink government, hobble it so that their industry pals can have better access. That's very clear. They're just taking swings now, trying to get there, and unfortunately, or fortunately, I think they're failing on many fronts. Yeah.
Before we answer the next question, I just want to mention, because this event is supported by state funding, we are supposed to keep track of who shows up, and so if you wouldn't mind signing the sheet before you leave, that'd be great.
I'm Jeff Gekko with Pima County. I want to say thank you for your federal service. I'm a former Department of Interior employee.
All right.
Now,
thank you.
Thank you. I have a great position with the county here, and local partners are doing great things in the Tucson area. My question really relates to how do we, as a scientific community, whether or not you're in government or academia, public, private, really get the message that you are sending or transmitting to us, that there are people that we really care about. And I know I've worked in many different systems in the West, and I really care about those ecological communities because I've spent a lot of time working in them. I've never been to Alaska, and I've seen lots of photos that are incredibly disheartening. How would you recommend to us to try to go back, speak to our family and friends, try to get that word out that, you know, these are things that we really as a society need to care about regardless of where you are on the political spectrum?
Yeah, you know, the trick, especially friends and family, it's always so fraught. But, you know, it's tempting. We want to talk about the things that we value when we pass this information on. But the key is to focus on the things that they value. And it's always so hard to do. Sometimes you can't relate. But if you can, if you know something they value, whether it's a particular economic trend or whether it's ecosystems, or if it's religion, find the things that they value and how do these issues connect to that? Because otherwise, it seems like people are turned off. They've already dug in on how they feel about climate change one way or the other, but they haven't dug in on how they feel about water or food or you know, skiing, right? So I think the trick is to find out where their values lie and then focus your climate change concerns on those values. And there are plenty of them. I don't think anyone in this country is completely isolated from the impacts of climate change. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Dan Kimbrough. I'm a former NPS employee, now retired, former SCSer.
Right.
And the question I have is about the climate change budget. I know what the president had proposed, but I know there's been a 2-year budget deal. What exactly did that do in terms of climate change science and the department?
Well, the president's budget certainly took some swings and some big cuts. At DOI, it was mostly USGS that took the hits on research, but the Park Service as well. And Park Service, by the way, the U.S. Park Service or the National Park Service has been way ahead of the curve on climate change in a lot of ways. They've been doing the research, they've been doing the planning, They've been getting ready for climate impacts. We in the Office of the Secretary were always very impressed by what they were pulling off there. They're being affected by this budget. But again, and you know, I think a lot of folks, you know this, but a lot of folks outside of the federal government don't understand that the president's budget is a fantasy. It's a priority document. It's not going to happen. Congress says, thank you very much for your suggestion. Now we're going to do the budget. And they're going to take some swings at climate change stuff also because they've wanted to for a while, but it's not going to be as dramatic as what the president proposed. That said, it's a big problem. And at DOI, I would say USGS and Park Service are taking the biggest hits because they had the most explicit funding designated for targeting climate change. Yeah.
Hi, Joe. My name is Celso Villegas, Water Director for the Water Resources for the Tohono O'odham Nation. Just wanted to thank you for helping them. I heard your name before from people that work up in the Northwest and in Alaska. I'm glad I met you. I'm glad I came because you're the type of people that really we need to look forward to because a lot of us here are not going to make the political challenge to take it on because it's hard.
It's hard.
Very hard. And I'm from the 60s and used to march everywhere against everything. We don't do that no more here. You know, we kind of lost our political activism. I'm still political and I'm still doing a lot of stuff. And so I just wanted to tell you that the lower 48s, the Indians here, American Indians, we recognize that a lot of you guys are in different capacities and you don't understand that, or maybe you do, that this is home and we're not going to go anywhere else. Where are we going to go? And so we decided at several levels from grassroots up to the governments, tribal governments, to start being vocal. Because apparently the Jiwatkacha, Mother Earth, it doesn't mean nothing to nobody. But we know where we're going to go. I mean, we can't go nowhere. This is it for us. I mean, we don't have $10 million to go to Mars or whatever, but just wanted to say that. But I wanted to say where you're at, when I was young, American Indian movement and all that stuff, boy, it's a lonely trip. It's scary. And the only thing I can tell you is that you can never become like them. You can never be those people you protest against. But the other thing I wanted to say, so thank you. We're having a lot of youth movements. We're going to try to take a staff all the way to the mall and put it there and tell everybody there that this is home. So we're going to do this. It's going to be another run because we have a lot of runners running to Washington, but you know, since we're Native Americans, really people don't look at us like we're here. We're kind of forgotten, but we do care a lot, actually. So anyway, I just wanted to say that in front of it. Thank you very much for your work. I'm glad I met you just for the short time. And what we call the North Star is Taiwa, which means it sits, it doesn't move.
Right. Oh, cool. I'm going to need that in writing. Thank you very much. Thanks also for those comments, because I'll say the same thing about the lower 48 tribes that I say about those in the Arctic, right? I mean, the foremost experts, those that have persisted for millennia and understood these transitions, and you know, these are the people we need to listen to, and you know, probably facing some of the most dramatic impacts too in Indian country that you're going to see in the lower 48. So absolutely, you're ground zero for this stuff, and I love hearing the activism is starting to spark up. You know, we're seeing a lot more political activism around the country, and that's just invigorating. So to me, it gives me all the hope right now that I need, even though it's very depressing what's happening in Washington and the kind of language and civil discourse that we're seeing, which is just embarrassing, and the lies. But that's what you just described, and what others are doing, organizing, is invigorating. So I think we're entering a new era of civic involvement, once again, decades after the 60s, I think, when the last time this all happened. So we're going to need leadership from folks that were there then. So thank you for your engagement. It's also, I appreciate it. And I need you to write down the name of the North Star in your language. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Barbara Warren, and I represent Physicians for Social Responsibility for the Arizona state. we work a lot on climate mitigation measures and adaptation, specifically related to extreme heat, which is our disaster, potential disaster, and ongoing. Maybe more so for everybody across the country. We also have a lot of people in this community, which we've tried to, with many other organizations, provide support who've adopted the Paris Climate Agreement, the City Council, the Board of Supervisors, and agreed to take that work on locally, as you were suggesting. Across the country, this is happening. My question is, how much hope do you have for climate mitigation at this point? And or do we just focus on adaptation? Of course, we have to keep trying, but how much hope do you have for turning things around?
Well, we do have to keep trying. And I actually do have some hope. It actually all sprung from being at the climate talks in Bonn in November. As you can imagine, the federal government, this time I wasn't sponsored by the U.S. government. I wasn't on the U.S. delegation. But Sweden kindly put me on their delegation so I could be there in Bonn. And I fully expected the crash and burn scenario, the Trump federal folks just embarrassing us. Certainly that happened, but the headlines were not U.S. comes to Bonn and fails. The headlines were the United States steps up in a huge way and presents some options going forward. It wasn't the federal government, but it was, you know, every country at the climate talks has a pavilion, and it depends on how much you spend. But there's a place to do talks and have symposia and so on. And this year, the U.S. federal government didn't do anything at all. They just had a room with a closed door. But Mike Bloomberg and Jerry Brown and some state and municipal leaders created the Climate Action Center, which was by far the biggest facility at the talks this year. And they had a full program the entire time of what the United States is doing outside of the federal government. And it was the headline of the whole event was how much the U.S. is doing now. And if you add together the GDP of all the states and cities and companies that joined what they called America's Pledge, it was the third largest country in the world. So it gave everyone there some hope that even without the federal government on board, you can take some great strides. So I took hope from that. But of course, until the federal government acts, particularly on the electricity production sector, we're not going to be doing what we need to do. But I call it the Trump effect, and it's a good thing in many cases because it's causing other people to step up in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise. All the other countries in Bonn were exceeding expectations in terms of their pledges, both on adaptation and mitigation. And it was because of all the noise around the Trump rhetoric. So as much as it's horrifying, it is leading to some good things. He'll be gone soon. It'll go by fast. And so I still have some hope. I can't think otherwise, right? I mean, we have to do better. We have to do way better than we pledged in Paris in the first place. I mean, we're clearly not going to meet the 2-degree goal, but we can do a lot more. So I still have some hope. Thanks. Yeah.
Raina Mayer, Interim Director of Institute of the Environment. I too thank you for your service. And my question is that follows this very well. Other people are stepping up and states are stepping up. And will create a shift in power and energy between the federal government and the state government. And do you have thoughts on how that's going to impact us when this federal government goes out of office? Is a new federal government going to be trusted?
You mean internationally or domestically?
Both.
I think, honestly, at this point, internationally, they're all onto this whole thing. They know that this is appalling and that most Americans are not supportive of what's going on right now. So I think a new government comes in, presuming it's not a similar administration, I think would be welcomed with open arms. And of course, that will be only so long as that administration demonstrates that it truly does feel strongly about fixing the climate change problem, right? So there's only going to be a grace period of a few months before some real progress needs to be demonstrated, at which time they would be, I'm sure the very next climate talks would be all about progress and there'd be a lot of strides taken. And I think the implications for how India and China respond are enormous, right? Because it's not much longer they're going to want to do this. if the U.S. is backpedaling for very long. So I think the implications go way beyond our emissions here in the U.S. because China and India, of course, that's the gorilla in the room, how those two countries respond. So I think if things go all right in the next election and there's an administration that cares about this, I think they'll be received very well. Domestically, I'm not worried either. I think the states love to have leadership on their priorities. Now, some states are not crazy about climate leadership, right? So we'll see how that goes, but I think it'll be all right. Yeah.
Hey, Joel, my name's Danny Kirk. I was just wondering, this might all be one and the same, but where would you like people to focus their resources, their time, their energy, their thoughts on? Is it globally or locally? Because, it seems like we have more influence locally, of course, but then it seems like the momentum and the tipping points of the warming of the Arctic are the thing that are really going to turn things bad for the entire globe. So where do we need to be focusing our time?
Thanks for that question, because I've long felt that the place that you can be most influential is the place where you're trusted and that your voice means something. So, we can waltz in, if I were to waltz into international negotiations, they'd kind of ignore me, right? It's not my job. If I were to walk into a trade union meeting and talk about this stuff, I'm not really the right messenger, but each of us has a community that we work with, whether it's our actual community, our neighborhood, a town or city or state, or whether it's your union or your professional association. I honestly think those are the places where you can bring the most change because your voice means something to them. So I always default to where do they trust you? And that's where to apply your energy. Yeah, good question. Thanks.
I'm Robert Bilacek. I'm a energy efficiency consultant. I'm very interested in the distortions in decision making that happens when the social cost or the externalities of projects don't get included. Can you talk a little bit about how those externalities are dealt with in federal programs, and how do you insist that social costs get included in any kind of cost-benefit analysis?
Yeah, that's been an interesting, it's very young in the federal government to consider social costs. The social cost to carbon has been their approach for a while now. But of course, each administration, the last two administrations have taken a wildly different approach to that. The Bush administration had a social cost to carbon. It wasn't factored into a lot of things. The Obama administration required that be focused in or included in a lot of assessments and environmental impact statements and so on. But the numbers change. So this administration is devaluing it once again, and they'd like to get rid of it, frankly. They don't like externalities being factored in. And the EPA under Scott Pruitt is trying to avoid that question altogether. But interestingly, some research has come out, actually it was earlier, maybe it was last week, the Stockholm Environment Institute, which I'm affiliated with, put out a report talking about what happens if we stop producing fossil fuels on federal lands. And every time that a project proponent proposes something that has emissions associated with it, if it's drilling for oil or natural gas or whether onshore or offshore, they kind of ignore the climate change externalities by using this perfect replacement concept, which is if we don't do it, someone else is going to do it. So there's actually no impact whatsoever, which is absurd, right? I mean, it makes no sense. And that's why this Stockholm Environment Institute report has been very helpful, because they did the research. They looked at the numbers and what happens when you don't produce a barrel of oil here. And it's actually about half, right? So there is some replacement. Economists will tell you that, but it's not perfect. It's not a perfect substitution. And it's about half. So, there is an active intellectual engagement on these things. This administration is not going to do much with the social cost of carbon or externalities at all, right? I mean, they've even changed the calculus behind the Clean Power Plan such that it isn't actually effective at all, right? I mean, they're monkeying with the externalities like you wouldn't believe. So I would look toward the next administration, preferably, hopefully it's a favorable administration toward fact and science. But if so, I think they'll take the externalities seriously, and we'll start to see some real science-guided public policy once again. That's essential. Yeah. Thanks.
I'm going to take one more question, and then we'll maybe he can answer. Oh, this one. We'll make it two because we've got one.
How's the government of Canada doing with the Canadian Arctic?
Oh, you know, it's interesting because Justin Trudeau is such a rock star and everybody loves him and he's saying all the right things. But some of the First Nations are not too happy about what's happening up there in the Arctic. They haven't quite done the work yet. They haven't put their money where their mouth is yet, but he's saying the right things. And, you know, this is a big challenge. You know, the Trump administration isn't even trying, right? But the Trudeau administration is saying those things, and we're waiting for those actions to come. They have started to invest in research again in the Arctic. The Harper administration, the prior administration, had tried to eliminate research across the board and muzzle scientists, much the way the Trump administration is doing. That's bouncing back. We're starting to see the research investments. But in terms of the First Nations of the North and the Inuit, we're not seeing much yet. So there's a lot of, you know, people are kind of waiting to see how that goes down. And, you know, he's very controversial about pipelines too. So the First Nations further south in Alberta are very ambivalent about this guy. So yeah, not sure yet, actually. He's saying the right things, which is a start. It's better than we have.
Okay, one more, and that's it.
Okay. So Jake Wildstein, U.S. Geological Survey. So Shishmaref isn't the only Alaska Native village that's in imminent danger of losses of infrastructure. I've heard something like 15, maybe 20 villages.
30.
How many?
Over 30.
Over 30. I'm thinking about, you know, infrastructure and sustainability. And there was a recent case related to maybe the town of King Cove and the development of a road. I think the decision has been made to go ahead and put the road in through the wildlife refuge, and Murkowski was pretty involved in that. And so I'm curious maybe as to what motivated action on the part of the Alaskan leadership to respond to that particular emergency there, but ignore the other issues around the state.
Well, you've just hit the nail on the head with some of the hypocrisy in Alaskan politics. Thanks for asking that, but no thanks for asking that because it's such a darn problematic issue. That was just something that Senator Murkowski just made that her thing. And if she had not gotten that road, she would have had a difficult time getting reelected. That's how much she emphasized that particular thing. Now, she's aware of these 30 villages, and she's aware of their vulnerability. And so she knows that it's there, but she has not chosen to focus on those the way she's chosen to focus on King Cove. And there are a few other interests at play there. It also gives her an opportunity to compromise a national wildlife refuge, which is something that I think she wanted to accomplish as a precedent. So frankly, I'm not sure she's that concerned about the health issues in that town. They had other ways that they could take care of that. That road probably wasn't necessary for that village. It just became a political cause celeb, and it became something she really was putting her political name on. So, you know, I hate to be so cynical, but I'm afraid. Now we hear that she's writing legislation to address resilience in the Bering Sea area. So hopefully that will come out, because President Trump did rescind the one executive order that President Obama signed to create a resilience area in the north there. So maybe, you know, maybe there's always a balance with the politicians, hopefully some kind of balance, and hopefully we'll see some good actions out of her. Yeah.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Joel, not just for his presentation today, but all of your service to our country, and particularly to the people who are most vulnerable. I hope that this conversation has really inspired all of you to go home and do similar things and take charge of the things you can really make a difference in. So thank you again, Joel. We really appreciate it.